Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries RPG podcast with John and Hannah.
Hi.
And today we're going to be talking about the feat system that is used in Eldritch Tales, Lovecraftian white box role-playing by Joseph D. Salvador.
So, John, you've been playing this game. I can see the book says Raven God Games and that it's Swords and Wizardry compatible. So, what's the white box thing that it's referencing?
Okay, white box is effectively an early version of sort of basic D&D. Swords and Wizardry is an old D&D sort of like retro clone. Swords and Wizardry leans a little bit more the core version towards sort of AD&D, whereas they did a white box version which leans more towards the basic sort of OD&D style.
Okay, and you played a game of this a couple of days ago?
Yeah, I played a game of this 2 days ago on Saturday, run by the author, and he was kind enough to run an adventure that I submitted to him a while ago for inclusion in his Eldritch Tales zine, which I know you've ran and adapted to like a science fiction setting.
Was this the one with the evil pharaoh?
Yeah, it was the Dark Pharaoh, yeah.
Yeah, my Star Trek group had great fun.
Yeah, and just to give you a bit of background to this, the adventure in itself was one that I originally prepared for Games on Demand at UK Games Expo in 2019, or as I like to call it, the before times, when we could all go outside. And for anyone who doesn't know, Games on Demand is basically for people who don't want to have to book loads in advance. There's loads of gems there. They run 2-hour taster sessions. You rock up, you buy a ticket quite cheaply, and you'll turn up and say, I want to play a game. And the person who's in charge, normally Lloyd Jan, or whoever's helping you with the admin, which in a lot of cases is you, love, will say, right, we've got these gems available to run a game. And then you'll be assigned a GM and a table. The GM will say, right, I've got these 5 or 6 games. Here's some of the scenarios I've got. What do you fancy? And then they'll just run a 2-hour taster session. So for this adventure, I basically originally cooked up the idea of let's make it a pulpy sort of Indiana Jones, explore the pyramid, sort of with a bit of a Cthulhu sort of flavour, which obviously ties in with Eldritch Tales because it uses the basic framework of old D&D, but adds that sort of level of Cthulhu mythos on top of it, so there's insanity mechanics and stuff like that. Now, obviously, I rewrote that and sort of expanded on it when I sent a copy to Joe, and he sort of worked up some great maps for it and stuff like that, and is going to publish it. So we played that game, very much enjoyed it, and one of the things I enjoyed while we were playing it is what it calls the feat system in this game. And now you may be familiar with the name feat from other versions of D&D, 3.5 onwards. However, although it uses the same terminology, it's not the same sort of thing in here. It's basically a slightly different way of doing attribute tests. Okay. So, as in Eldritch Tales, as in most D&D sort of clones, you've got your strength, dex, con, wisdom, intelligence, and charisma. They're your attributes. Now, normally, they range from 3 to 18 for your standard sort of human character. And generally, if you want to make an attribute test in a D&D style game, you roll a d20. If you get equal to or under the attribute, you've succeeded. Happy days. If not, you've failed. Now, Eldritch Tales does this slightly differently by sort of bringing that back to a d6 roll. Now, in old D&D, there's a few things that already rely on d6 rolls. The most obvious one I think of off the top of my head is if you're in a hex crawl and you're exploring the wilderness, the person who's planning your route, they'll make a roll of a d6 to see if they manage to pick the right direction and not get lost. And it's normally a 1 in 6 chance of you getting lost. But there's a few other sort of old D&D classes, and particular old school essentials classes and various games based on old D&D, which will have special abilities that come off a d6. So what they've done in Eldritch Tales is they have what's called the Universal Attribute Modifier. And what that basically means is if you have an attribute that goes from 3 to 6, anytime you want to do a feat involving that attribute, you roll a d6 and you need a 6 to succeed. If you got 7 to 14, you roll a d6, you need a 5 or 6 to succeed. If you have 15 to 18 in your stat, you need to roll a d6, and you have a 4 to 6 chance of succeeding. So you don't roll against your attribute directly, but how big an attribute you've got determines what your chance of success is on a d6. So looking at the sample character sheet I was playing the other day, I was playing a sort of scholarly, like, occult type. So for my intelligence, I had 15 for the character. So if I wanted to do a roll involving intelligence, I'd roll a d6, and if I get a 4 to 6, I've succeeded.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, this is really just a way of doing a challenge such as a feat of strength, can you lift the barrel over your head?
Exactly, yeah.
Feat of dexterity, can you run across the rope bridge? Feat
Exactly,
of
yeah.
charisma, can you seduce the barmaid?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Very much so. And there's a little table in here, so the GM, if it's particularly difficult or a hard roll, they can apply like minuses to that d6 roll. Also, they have a couple of additional mechanics in Eldritch Tales called class skills and occupational specialities. Class skills are just particular skills you might have. You don't have levels in them or anything like that. You just get them based on your class. So I was playing an antiquarian in the game we played a couple of days ago. So I had 3 knowledge class skills: history, literature, and mythology. I had the research skill, and I had the writing skill. Now, if you make a feat roll, i.e. an attribute test, and you've got a class skill, you get a +1 to whatever your d6 roll is. So you don't have any levels of different skills or anything. It's just if you've got the skill, you get a +1. So in an intelligence-based roll, where I normally need 4 to 6 on the roll, if it's to do with research or one of my areas of knowledge, I only really need 3 to 6 on the roll. You also have what are called occupational specialities. And for my character, I had interaction, occult, knowledge, religion, and physical sciences. And what these do is when you roll your d6 to do your feat, you get like an advantage sort of style mechanic where you roll 2d6 and you take the better result. So, and all of these can be quite broadly defined. And I really enjoyed it while we were playing because it made everything very simple, because everything was like a d6 roll, which I quite enjoyed. And also the skills and the occupational specialities, because it's obvious what they are, you know, like research, writing, mythology, it's pretty obvious whether it applies or not. We didn't have to spend ages poring over like different skill systems or looking at anything like that. I could just look down my skill list and go, oh yeah, I think this applies, +1. And my occupational specialities, which tend to be like your job. So in my case, I was like a university professor of like the occult and stuff like that. So if it came under the occupational specialities, I was like, oh great, 2d6. Nice and simple. If you have more than one of those, so a skill applies and a speciality applies, obviously you just roll 2d6, pick the best one, add +1 to the roll. It's nice and simple. Unless the GM's modifying the difficulties, you can always see what you're going to get. If you've got a really high score, you've got like an even or better chance of succeeding. If you've got a low score, unless you've got some bonuses, it's unlikely you're going to succeed. But still, you've got a 1 in 6 chance, even if you've got no other bonuses and you've got a really rubbish score. So, you know, if you're a bit desperate, you might like to try it. And I was just...
So, how does this compare to rolling a d20 and adding your skill stat, which is what you'd normally be doing in D&D these days?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things... I mean, D&D 5th edition simplified the skill list an awful lot. Whereas in, as we've talked about previously, in 3rd edition 3.5...
Or even simpler for pretty much any D&D, you'd feat of strength, roll a d20... What's your strength? What's your strength bonus? Add that onto it. What's the result? Dead simple. One roll to get through.
I would say
through a lot of.
I would say the bonus over that sort of thing is in like 3.5. Let's say you're doing your feat of strength or whatever. You'll roll a d20. You'll have to look up what your bonus is for your strength. You add that. You'll then have, if the skill's relative, you'll have to look down, find out what your level of skill is, add that on. If there's any situational bonuses, you add them on. You add there's like 3 or 4 numbers you add on. You calculate all that up, then you roll your dice. Whereas with this, normally the only number you have to worry about is what number you're rolling and do you add a +1 to it. So it makes it nice and simple. Now, one thing in Eldritch Tales is because it's like 1920s sort of classic mythos era, you are playing sort of, I suppose, a bit more grounded sort of like human level characters. So the bonuses are literally like very small in here. Because you don't have those sort of like superhuman levels of abilities you would tend to see in sort of like higher fantasy games. But for me, it just removed a lot of numbers out of the equation. It made it very simple to do. And also, I know some people say, oh, it's not difficult to roll a d20 and roll under your attribute score to see if you succeed. And it's not really. But as I've said, when it comes to things like armour class, although there's nothing wrong with using descending armour class, I prefer ascending because I just find it more intuitive. Because the notion of like a higher number is better just seems more intuitive, and it certainly seems easier for like new people to the game to grasp. So if I can say to people, okay, you've got a poor skill in this, so you've got to roll a 6. Oh, okay, you've got a medium skill in this, you've got to roll a 5 or a 6. Oh, you've got a great skill in this, you've got to roll a 4, 5 or 6. Because it's a smaller range of numbers, it's very easy to grasp. And I found this when I was running it at UK Games Expo, because obviously you have like a random assortment of people come in, and most people have got some basic familiarity with D&D. But for the people who really didn't know much about it, it was very easy in Eldritch Tales to just sort of say, right, all you need to worry about is, here's a couple of D6, here's what you're going to have to roll. I could have it written on the character sheet, and it was very easy for them to pick up.
So, by having a sort of less nuanced dice system, it makes it easier to effectively game the numbers, work out what you want to do based on that, understand like the tactics of the game that bit more easily and intuitively.
Yeah, basically.
And obviously that gives you more time for like actual role play.
Yeah, and that, again, that's one of the things I enjoyed in the game I played in it a couple of days ago, which, because Joe was like, obviously we're trying to keep it fairly sort of snappy and fairly short. There was a few moments where like we've been chatting and like role playing, so we had pre-gen characters all with a bit of background. We're on this like dig in like Egypt, and we're all like chatting amongst each other and sort of role playing and getting to know our characters. And we had a few bits where Joe's like, oh, I should probably move this on now, it's been like 15 minutes. And we were like, oh, has it? Because we'd all just been role playing, and like we'd not even like touched the dice or like rolled anything on roll 20. But when we did get to like the later stages where there was a little bit of combat, you know, we're climbing down ropes, we're in like hazardous situations, and we needed to roll the dice, again, it was very quick to do. Particularly, I mean, we were playing in Roll20, and the Roll20 is great if you have loads of character sheets are automated and set up, so you can just click on a button and boom, it rolls and calculates everything for you. For some games, and I'm not saying all of them, but for some games, if you don't have that set up, like it's a more niche game, it can involve like a lot of typing in, like /R 1d20 plus minus da-da-da-da, and it could take a while to type all that out. Whereas in this, because we were just rolling a d6, and you're only adding 1 or 2 numbers, it was very quickly just be like, right, roll 1d6, I've got a +1, yeah, I've rolled a 3, with my +1 that gives me a 4, that's what I needed to succeed, happy days. And you can crack on with that. And one of the things I liked about this is like the combat in Eldritch Tales is pretty much your standard D&D fare, you know, roll a d20, add your thing, beat the armour class, roll your damage. So it's very easy to graft this system onto like any other version of D&D. Now, I'm not a big fan of, because you know me, I like running like old school essentials and stuff like that models like the older sort of simpler versions of D&D, like the basic D&D. But I can see that there is a place for having like skill systems and sort of occupation systems in RPGs, because it can add like a bit of flavour to it. So it might be more interesting rather than just so like, say you've got a couple of people playing fighters, instead of just going like, oh yeah, we've got fighter 1 and fighter 2, it might be a bit more interesting if like, oh, we've got fighter 1, oh, he used to be a baker, oh, we've got fighter 2, he's like an ironmonger's son, and like that. And you can say that, obviously, but it doesn't have any tangible effect on the game unless you just sort of like freestyle it. Whereas if you were using a system like this, you don't have to do a lot of work with it. You're like, here's a sample list of occupations. That's not difficult to work out. You can go on the internet and type in like medieval occupations, and you'll get a massive list of them. And you can just go, right, there you go, players, give them that list. And all you've got to remember is they pick one of them. If they're rolling and they've got that occupation that's relevant, then they get 2 dice instead of 1. Happy days. Likewise with a list of skills, you just put a small list of skills. If you've got one of these, you get a +1 on your roll. Happy days. It's nice and easy to administrate, which I think would make it very easy to graft into other versions of D&D. And I mean, recently in my Old School Essentials campaign, there's an optional rule in one of the advanced fantasy books, which is like a secondary occupation rule, where there's basically like a big table of occupations for like faux medieval times, but it doesn't really give you any like rules for them. It's just like, it's just a bit of flavour. You know, the GM can take it into account. It might help you out in certain situations. But in the spirit of keeping Old School Essentials simple, there's not really any rules in it. And that's fine. I've been running with that, and that's not a problem. I mean, I've generally just gone for the fact, if it's something that's not life-threatening and your skill is relevant, you can do it. So let's say, just to pick a ridiculous example, your like character in my Old School Essentials campaigns are like, oh, we need to like bake some bread for this village. And I go, oh yeah, you've got a baker as like your secondary occupation. You were a baker before you became an adventurer. I would say, yeah, you don't have to make a roll for it. You've baked that bread. And to be honest, I probably wouldn't ask for a roll for it if you hadn't got that skill. But I might say, well, it takes you a lot less time and there's a lot less waste because you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And that's worked absolutely fine. However, if I wanted like a skill system, an occupational system that actually had an impact in the rules, I would love to use something like the Eldritch Tales system, because it gives you a little bit more detail. You know, you get your 2 dice instead of 1 if you've got the occupation. You get a couple of bonuses to like your rolls if you've got skills. But it doesn't add an awful lot of complexity. It keeps everything on like a very small dice, so like D6, a dice we're all familiar with. It keeps the range of numbers quite small, and it also gives you that sort of bonus and system benefit for having some of those background elements. So I instantly, like I say, we were using pre-gens in the game we played a couple of days ago. I instantly looked at my character sheet and I was like, right, class skills, knowledge, history, literature and mythology, research and writing, occupational specialities, interaction, occult, knowledge, religion, physical science. So just by looking at that, you can see what sort of character background this guy has. And occupational stuff tends to be more common in things like Call of Cthulhu and modern settings. But I don't see any reason you couldn't take that and sort of port it into like old school D&D. I think it'd work quite well for that. And like I say, I don't know whether I'll do that in my Old School Essentials campaign, because I'm trying to keep the number of random house rules I'm importing to a minimum. But if I was going to go for a skill system in an old school D&D game, I'd probably go for something like this, because it's simple, does what it says on the tin, and doesn't overly complicate your game.
Sounds good.
So, there you go. That's my brief rundown of the feat system in Eldritch Tales by Joseph D. Salvador of Raven God Games. If you want to check it out, it's available from Drive-Thru RPG. I'll put a link in the show notes for that. If you want to get in touch with us, you can leave us a voicemail message using SpeakPipe. Again, there'll be a link in the description of this show. Or you can email us at rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, and keep gaming.
Bye.
Welcome back to the Red Dice Hall. That can go in the outtakes.